They say you never truly know someone until you see them at their worst. For me, that revelation came on a rainy Tuesday evening when my husband of 8 years, Nathan, sat me down in our living room with an expression I'd never seen before. Peculiar mixture of guilt, determination, and something else I couldn't quite place. Relief, perhaps? I remember the way the expensive crystal chandelier I had selected for our home cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his features as he delivered the words that would change everything. Olivia has nowhere else to go. Elena, he said, his voice carefully measured as he referred to his secretary. Her apartment flooded, and in her condition. Well, I told her she could stay here, just until she finds a new place. I stared at him, the cup of tea in my hand suddenly feeling too hot against my skin. Her condition? I repeated, though a part of me already knew the answer. Nathan's eyes flickered down to his hands before meeting mine again. She's pregnant. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room, heavy and suffocating. I set my teacup down on the marble coffee table, the soft clink echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. I see, I said finally, my voice surprisingly steady despite the hurricane building inside me. And when were you planning to tell me that you're the father? His eyes widened slightly, not with guilt or shame, but with surprise that I had connected the dots so quickly. It was all the confirmation I needed. It's complicated, he began, the oldest excuse in the book. I held up my hand, stopping him mid-sentence. When is she arriving? Tomorrow afternoon, he replied, looking somewhat relieved that I wasn't screaming or throwing things. Little did he know that screaming and throwing things had never been my style. I had always preferred a different approach to problems. I nodded once, then twice, processing this information with an outward calm that I knew unnerved him. I'll prepare the guest bedroom. Nathan blinked, clearly having expected more resistance. You're okay with this? I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress. What choice do I have? You've already made the decision without me. Then I left the room before he could see the calculations already beginning behind my eyes. What my husband didn't know, what he had never bothered to fully understand, was that the company he so proudly called his own, Morgan Architectural Innovations, wasn't actually his at all. It was mine. Every share, every asset, every decision ultimately rested in my hands, though I had allowed him to play CEO for years while I quietly managed my family's diverse portfolio of businesses from behind the scenes. My grandfather had built the firm from nothing. My father had expanded it, and when I inherited it at 25, I had transformed it into one of the most respected architectural firms on the East Coast. When I met Nathan, a charismatic architect, with ambition blazing in his eyes, I thought I had found a partner in every sense of the word. I gave him the title, the office, the prestige, and he had given me this. I spent that night in our home office, surrounded by the certificates and awards that bore his name but were built on my family's legacy. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I scrolled through company files, financial records, and project portfolios, I realized how easy it would be to dismantle everything he had come to identify as his success. But that would be too quick, too merciful. No, this situation called for something more. Instructive. The next day, I greeted Olivia at the door with a warm smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. She was younger than I had expected. Perhaps in her mid-20s, with honey blonde hair and a small but visible baby bump beneath her floral dress. Her eyes darted nervously around our marble foyer, taking in the high ceilings and designer furniture. "Thank you for having me," she said, her voice soft and uncertain. Mr. Morgan says it will just be for a few weeks." "Of course," I replied, leading her up the grand staircase to our guest wing. "We have plenty of room, and I wouldn't dream of leaving anyone in your condition without proper accommodations." As I showed her the guest suite, I noticed the way Her fingers trailed over the expensive linens, how her eyes widened at the private bathroom with its rainfall shower and deep soaking tub. She was clearly impressed and intimidated. Good. Nathan mentioned you've been his secretary for almost a year now? I asked casually as I opened the curtains to reveal the view of our manicured gardens. Yes, she nodded, setting her small suitcase beside the bed. He's been an amazing boss, so understanding and supportive, especially with everything. Her hand rested briefly on her stomach. I'm sure he has, I said, my smile never faltering. My husband has always been generous with company resources. The slight emphasis I placed on company resources went unnoticed by Olivia, who was now unpacking her meager belongings into the antique dresser I had imported from France. I watched her for a moment longer, this young woman who thought she was stepping into my life, my home, perhaps even my role. If only she knew what that truly entailed. Dinner is at 7, I informed her. Nathan often works late, but I thought, tonight we could all dine together, get better acquainted. That sounds lovely, she replied with a nervous smile. I left her to settle in and retreated to my private study, the one room in the house that remained exclusively mine. There, I made a phone call to my most trusted ally, my cousin Veronica, who also happened to be the company's chief financial officer. You're not serious, Veronica gasped when I explained the situation. He brought his pregnant mistress into your home? What are you going to do? Nothing, I replied, my voice calm as I gazed out at the garden where the gardener was trimming the hedges into perfect geometric shapes. At least, nothing immediately. I want to understand what exactly he thinks he's doing first. And then? Veronica prompted, knowing me too well to believe I would simply accept this humiliation. And then, I said, I'll remind everyone exactly who owns Morgan Architectural Innovations and everything else in this household. Dinner that evening was an exercise in restraint. I wore one of my favorite dresses, a deep burgundy sheath, that highlighted the figure I had maintained through rigorous workouts and careful diet. My grandmother's diamonds glittered at my throat, a reminder of the legacy I carried. Nathan noticed. I saw his eyes widen slightly when I entered the dining room, but he quickly returned his attention to Olivia, who looked painfully out of place at our formal table. Olivia was just telling me about the Westbrook project, Nathan said as our housekeeper served the first course. She's been an incredible asset to the team. I'm sure she has, I replied, taking a sip of my wine. Westbrook. That's the new sustainable office complex, isn't it? I was looking over the financials just yesterday. Ambitious project. Nathan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. You were looking at the Westbrook financials? Just keeping an eye on investments, I said lightly. Old habits. Olivia glanced between us, clearly sensing the undercurrent but unable to decipher it. The designs are amazing, she offered. Nathan's vision is going to transform the entire riverfront area. Nathan's vision, I echoed, raising my glass, in a small toast. Yes, he's always had a talent for seeing potential where others might miss it. I turned to her with a practiced smile. How did you come to work at Morgan, Olivia? I don't believe I've heard the story. Oh, she said, clearly, pleased to have a neutral topic. I actually applied for the receptionist position, but during my interview, Nathan said I was overqualified and offered me the executive assistant role instead. It was such a lucky break. My degree is in business administration, but jobs in this market are so competitive. Indeed they are, I agreed. And now you're carrying the next generation of the Morgan legacy. Life takes such interesting turns. Nathan coughed, nearly choking on his wine. Elena? What? It's true, isn't it? I turned back to Olivia. How far along are you, dear? 4 months, she replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. I found out right after the company holiday party. Of course, The holiday party I had missed because I was in Singapore, closing a deal that would add another billion to our portfolio. How convenient. December is such a magical time, I mused, full of surprises. The remainder of the dinner progressed, with similar tension simmering beneath polite conversation. I asked Olivia about her family, estranged, her plans for the baby, uncertain, and her career aspirations, currently on hold. With each answer, I pieced together a clearer picture. She was vulnerable, isolated, and completely dependent on Nathan, exactly the type of woman a man like him would target. After dinner, Nathan escorted Olivia back to her room, claiming she needed rest. When he returned to our bedroom, I was already sitting at my vanity, methodically removing my makeup. "What was that about?" he demanded, closing the door behind him. I met his eyes in the mirror. What about? I was simply getting to know our house guest, the mother of your child. Isn't that what you wanted? You know that's not. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing, but now recognized as a tell for when he was constructing a lie. This is already complicated enough without you making it worse. Complicated, I repeated, turning to face him directly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Is that what we're calling infidelity these days? An interesting euphemism. It wasn't planned, he said, loosening his tie with jerky movements. It just happened. Things don't just happen, Nathan. Decisions are made, actions are taken, consequences follow. I stood up, the silk of my robe flowing around me. And speaking of consequences, we should discuss what happens next. What do you mean? A flicker of wariness crossed his face. I mean, I said calmly, that you've created a rather significant change in our household dynamic. I'm simply wondering what your plan is. Are you leaving me for Olivia? Are you expecting us to raise this child together in some progressive, modern family arrangement? Or perhaps you haven't thought that far ahead? Nathan's expression confirmed my suspicion. He hadn't thought beyond his immediate desires. Typical. I don't know yet, he admitted finally. But I couldn't just leave her with nowhere to go. She has no family, no close friends in the city. The baby is my responsibility. How noble, I remarked, the sarcasm subtle but unmistakable. And what about your responsibility to me? To our marriage? He had the decency to look ashamed, at least. I never meant to hurt you. And yet, here we are. I turned back to my vanity, dismissing him as clearly as if I had pointed to the door. Good night, Nathan. That night, as he slept in the guest room down the hall, I lay awake planning. Not the passionate, chaotic plotting of a wronged wife in a soap opera, but the strategic, methodical planning of a businesswoman who had been underestimated one too many times. By morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first step was information. I needed to understand exactly what Nathan had told Olivia about me, about our marriage, about the company. So I did what any good CEO would do. I took her to lunch. I thought we could get to know each other better, I told her the next day, finding her nervously fidgeting in the kitchen, without Nathan around to manage the conversation. Oh, she said, clearly startled by the invitation. That's very kind of you. I drove us to a small, elegant restaurant where I knew we wouldn't be interrupted, watching as she fidgeted with her napkin throughout the appetizer course. You seem nervous, I observed, cutting directly to the point. Is it because you're living with your boss's wife while carrying his child? Or is there something else? Her head snapped up, eyes wide. I don't. Let's not pretend, I said gently. It's exhausting, and neither of us has the luxury of wasted energy right now. You're pregnant with my husband's baby, and somehow you've ended up in my guest bedroom. I think we're well past social niceties, don't you? She stared at me for a long moment before her shoulders slumped slightly. I never meant for any of this to happen. Nathan, he told me that you and that you had an arrangement. An arrangement, I repeated, keeping my face neutral despite the flash of fury that surged through me. How interesting. And what did this supposed arrangement entail? He said you were more focused on your family business, that your marriage was mostly a partnership, that you had your own life, and he had his. She couldn't meet my eyes anymore. I would never have, if I'd known. If you'd known he was lying? I supplied. Yes, that would have been valuable information. A tear slipped down her cheek. I'm so sorry. I'll leave today. I can figure something out. No, I said, surprising both of us. No, you won't. What? You're going to stay right where you are, I explained, taking a deliberate sip of my water. In my home, under my roof, where I can see exactly what unfolds next. She looked bewildered. I don't understand. You will, I assured her. In time. But first, I'd like you to tell me everything Nathan has said about the company. About his position, his authority, his vision. By the time dessert arrived, I had a complete picture of Nathan's deception. Not only had he led Olivia to believe our marriage was essentially in name only, but he had also painted himself as the founder and owner of Morgan Architectural Innovations. He had told her about his plans to expand the company, to take it in bold new directions that would secure their future together. He had even hinted at making her a partner once she understood the business better. It was almost impressive, the elaborate fantasy he had constructed. Almost. Champagne, he had told her when they discovered she was pregnant. We'll celebrate properly when the timing is right. This is the beginning of everything we've talked about. Their child would inherit the Morgan legacy, he promised. Their future was secure, if only he knew. As we left the restaurant, Olivia looked simultaneously relieved and terrified. The truth had lightened one burden but created another. What happens now? She asked as we sat in my car, the engine running but the vehicle still in park. I considered her for a moment, this young woman who had been so thoroughly deceived, who now carried an innocent life that would forever be connected to mine through my husband's betrayal. She wasn't the villain in this story, merely another pawn in Nathan's game of self-importance. Now, I said, shifting the car into drive, we begin the education of Nathan Morgan. Over the next week, I moved through our home like a ghost, observing the dynamic between Nathan and Olivia when they thought I wasn't watching. The guilty glances, the careful distance they maintained in my presence, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. I noticed how he checked his phone when it buzzed during dinner, how he worked later and later at the office. What he didn't realize was that I had already set my plan in motion. Veronica had begun a comprehensive audit of all company projects under Nathan's supervision. I had scheduled meetings with our major clients, ostensibly for quarterly reviews, but actually to gauge their satisfaction with Nathan's leadership. I had even had lunch with our head of HR to review all personnel files related to Nathan's executive assistant position. All 5 women who had held it over the past 3 years. A pattern emerged, not of outright harassment, but of favoritism, of blurred professional boundaries, of young women who left abruptly with generous severance packages and airtight non-disclosure agreements. Meanwhile, at home, I was unfailingly polite to Olivia, even kind when Nathan wasn't around. I helped her find an obstetrician who specialized in high-risk pregnancies. Just to be safe, I assured her. I gave her books on childcare and prenatal health. I even took her shopping for maternity clothes at boutiques I knew Nathan could never afford on his actual salary. The one I authorized, not the inflated figure he had apparently quoted to Olivia. I don't understand why you're being so nice to me, she confessed one afternoon as we returned from a doctor's appointment I had insisted on accompanying her to. If I were in your position, what would you do? I asked, genuinely curious. Throw both of you out? Divorce him immediately? Make a public scene? She shrugged helplessly. Any of those would make more sense than this. I smiled, the first genuine one I had shared with her. Olivia, there's something you should understand about me. I believe in addressing problems at their source, and you, I gently tapped her nose, are not the source of this problem. Her eyes widened slightly. Nathan? Getting warmer, I said, turning into our driveway. But not quite. The source of this problem is much deeper than my husband's inability to keep his promises, or his pants on. We pulled up to the house just as Nathan was arriving home earlier than usual. He looked surprised to see us together, then concerned. Is everything okay? He asked, his eyes darting between us. Perfect, I replied. Just a little girl's day out. Olivia had a doctor's appointment, and I wanted to make sure everything was progressing well with the baby. The flash of panic in his eyes was delicious. You went to her appointment? Of course. Someone needs to ask the important questions. I turned to Olivia with a warm smile. Why don't you go rest? You heard what the doctor said about taking it easy. She nodded, giving Nathan an unreadable look before disappearing into the house. What are you doing, Elena? Nathan asked once we were alone, his voice low and tense. I tilted my head, considering him. The man I had once loved enough to share my life, my legacy, my family name with. The man who had taken everything I gave, him and still wanted more. I'm taking care of what's mine, I replied simply. All of it. I walked past him into the house, leaving him standing in the driveway with an expression of growing unease. The first cracks were appearing in his carefully constructed world. Soon, very soon, it would all come tumbling down around him, and I would be there, not to pick up the pieces, but to reclaim what had always been mine. The following week brought a subtle shift in the company's operations. Nothing dramatic enough to raise immediate alarms. I was too strategic for that. But a series of small, deliberate adjustments that only someone paying close attention would notice. Client meetings previously handled by Nathan were now being assigned to other senior architects. Project approvals that once required only his signature suddenly needed additional review from the board, a board I had quietly reconstituted with my most trusted associates. I arrived at the office on Wednesday morning, something I rarely did since allowing Nathan to be the public face of Morgan Architectural Innovations. The receptionist nearly dropped her coffee when I walked through the main entrance. Mrs. Morgan, she exclaimed, scrambling to her feet. We weren't expecting you today. Just a surprise visit, I said with a pleasant smile. No need to announce me. I know my way around. As I moved through the corridors of sleek glass and polished concrete that my grandfather had first established 6 decades ago, I observed the company culture Nathan had fostered in my absence. Young employees huddled over drafting tables, dark circles under their eyes suggesting the punishing. Hours I'd heard rumors about. Administrative staff moved with a nervous energy, jumping whenever a door opened too loudly. This wasn't the collaborative, innovative environment I had envisioned when I'd stepped back to let Nathan take the reins. When I reached the executive suite, Nathan's latest assistant, the one who had replaced Olivia, stared at me in confusion. Mr. Morgan is in a budget meeting, she informed me, glancing uncertainly at her computer screen. He doesn't have any appointments until lunch. That's all right, I replied, moving past her desk toward his office. I'm not on his calendar. I opened the door without knocking to find Nathan alone, feet propped on his desk, laughing into his phone. He froze when he saw me, the smile vanishing from his face. I have to go, he said abruptly to whoever was on the line. Something's come up. I closed the door behind me, taking in the space that had once been my father's office. The family photos were gone, replaced by architectural awards and framed magazine covers featuring Nathan's projects. My grandfather's antique desk had been switched out for something aggressively modern, all steel and glass with nowhere to hide. "Budget meeting?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. Nathan cleared his throat, straightening in his chair. "It wrapped up early. What are you doing here, Elena?" "I own the place," I reminded him mildly. "I thought I should check in on my investment." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "You've never shown interest in day-to-day operations before." Things change. I settled into the chair across from him. Perspectives shift. Priorities are reconsidered. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Is this about Olivia? Because if you're here to make some kind of scene..." "Please," I interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm not that predictable. I'm here about the Westbrook project. Actually." The slight widening of his eyes told me I had caught him off guard. "What about it?" "The sustainability elements you've been promoting to the media, the living walls, the rainwater reclamation system, the solar integration, they're central to the client's vision, correct?" "Of course," he said cautiously. "It's why they chose us." "Why?" I pulled my tablet from my bag, opening a series of financial reports I had spent the previous night reviewing. "Because according to these budget revisions you approved last month, you've eliminated or dramatically scaled back all of those features." His face paled slightly. "Those were necessary adjustments to keep the project within budget. The client understood." "Did they?" I slid the tablet across to him, open to an email exchange between the Westbrook Foundation and our account manager, an exchange that had conspicuously not been forwarded to Nathan. "Because it seems they've just discovered these changes and are, to quote directly, reconsidering their relationship with Morgan Architectural Innovations." Nathan stared at the screen, then at me. "How did you get access to these emails?" I smiled. "Nathan, darling, you seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about our arrangement. Let me clarify. You work for me. You always have." The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" "When we met, you were a talented but struggling architect with student loans and a small apartment you could barely afford. I saw potential in you, professional and personal. I gave you opportunities, connections, eventually a position at my family's firm." I leaned forward. "But make no mistake, Morgan Architectural Innovations belongs to me. Every share, every asset, every client relationship." "That's not possible," he insisted, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "I've been running this company for years." "With my permission," I corrected. "Under my authority. Check the shareholder agreements if you don't believe me. Check the board minutes. Check the trust documents my grandfather established. This company has always remained in the Morgan family. My family." I watched as realization dawned on his face, followed quickly by something darker. Anger, perhaps, or wounded pride. "Why are you telling me this now?" he demanded. "Because you needed the reminder." I stood, retrieving my tablet. "The Westbrook project will proceed as originally, designed with all sustainability features intact. You'll personally call them today to assure them of this fact. And moving forward, any budget revisions over $50,000 will require my explicit approval. You can't just come in here and..." "I can, actually." I cut him off with a calm that seemed to infuriate him further. "Consider this the beginning of a more hands-on approach to my investment." As I turned to leave, he called after me. "Is this how it's going to be now, Elena? You undermining me professionally because you're upset about my personal life?" I paused at the door, turning back to face him. "Don't flatter yourself, Nathan. This isn't personal, it's business. The fact that you can't tell the difference is precisely the problem." I left him sitting there, staring after me with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The trap I had set was beginning to close, and he had just realized his foot was caught in it. When I returned home that evening, I found Olivia in the kitchen, awkwardly attempting to reach a glass on one of the higher shelves. Her pregnancy was becoming more pronounced, her baby bump straining against the fabric of the maternity dress I had bought her. "Let me," I offered, reaching past her to retrieve the glass. "We should reorganize these cabinets to make things more accessible for you." "Thanks," she murmured, accepting the glass with a grateful smile. "You don't have to do that. I'm not staying that long, remember?" I leaned against the counter, studying her. "And where exactly do you plan to go, Olivia?" She filled her glass with water from the filtered dispenser, avoiding my gaze. "I've been looking at some apartments, smaller places, but more affordable." "On a secretary's salary?" I asked gently. "In this city? With a baby on the way?" Her shoulders slumped, slightly. "I've been saving." I nodded, opening the refrigerator to pull out ingredients for dinner. "And has Nathan discussed child support arrangements? Health insurance for the baby? Childcare costs?" Olivia's silence was answer enough. I set a package of fresh pasta on the counter more forcefully than necessary, making her jump. "I thought as much," I said. "Men like Nathan are excellent at making grand promises, but remarkably poor at considering practical realities." "He said once the Westbrook project is completed, there would be a bonus," she offered weakly. "And that he might be able to find me a better position in the company." I couldn't help the short laugh that escaped me. Did he now? How generous of him with company resources. She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I considered how much to reveal. Olivia was a victim of Nathan's manipulations, but she wasn't entirely innocent either. She had made choices that had hurt me deeply. Yet there was something in her naive belief in Nathan's promises that stirred an unexpected protectiveness in me. "Nothing," I said finally, returning to my dinner preparations. "Just that Nathan has a history of making commitments he can't personally fulfill." We worked side by side preparing the meal, falling into a strangely comfortable rhythm. I showed her how to make my grandmother's secret pasta sauce, a recipe Nathan had always loved but never bothered to learn. As we cooked, Olivia gradually opened up more about her relationship with Nathan, revealing details that filled in the gaps of his betrayal. "He said you weren't interested in having children," she confessed as we sat at the kitchen island, waiting for the sauce to simmer. "That you were too focused on your family businesses to want a family of your own." The wooden spoon in my hand stilled. "Did he?" She nodded, oblivious to the rage building inside me. "He said it was one of the main problems in your marriage. That he always wanted to be a father, but you refused to even discuss it." I set the spoon down carefully, afraid I might snap it in two if I held it any longer. Nathan and I had indeed discussed children, but the narrative had been entirely different. I had wanted them. He had insisted we wait until his career was more established, until he had made a name for himself, until the timing was right. Year after year, the right time never seemed to arrive, and eventually, I had stopped asking. The irony that he had gotten his secretary pregnant while telling me we weren't ready for children was so bitter I could taste it. "Olivia," I said, measuring my words carefully, "I think it's time you understood exactly who Nathan Morgan is, and who I am." By the time Nathan arrived home, the truth had been laid bare. Olivia knew everything: how Nathan had manipulated both of us, how he had built his career on my family's legacy while systematically pushing me into the background, how the company and its assets were legally mine. She sat at the dining room table, eyes red from crying, as Nathan walked in. He stopped short when he saw us, immediately sensing something had changed. "What's going on?" "We were just having a fascinating discussion about Morgan architectural innovations," I said pleasantly, pouring a glass of wine that I had no intention of drinking. About ownership structures, succession planning, that sort of thing. The color drained from his face as his eyes darted to Olivia. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," I replied simply. "Something you might want to try sometime." Nathan dropped his briefcase by the door, running a hand through his hair. That tell I had learned to recognize years ago. "Elena, this isn't appropriate dinner conversation?" I suggested. "Perhaps not. But then, neither is discovering your husband's pregnant mistress is living in your guest bedroom. We seem to be breaking all sorts of social conventions lately." Olivia stood abruptly, one hand protectively covering her belly. "I should go." "You'll do no such thing," I countered firmly. "This is between Nathan and me. You've been lied to enough already." Nathan looked between us, clearly trying to assess which way the wind was blowing and how to adjust his sails accordingly. It was a skill he had perfected during our marriage, reading the room, adapting his position, always landing on his feet. "Look," he began, his voice taking on that reasonable, calming tone he used in difficult client meetings. "I know this situation isn't ideal." "Not ideal?" I repeated incredulously. "You lied to your pregnant mistress about owning a company. That belongs to me. You lied to me about wanting children. You've been systematically cutting corners on projects to inflate profit margins that directly benefit your bonus structure. Not ideal doesn't begin to cover it, Nathan." He straightened, his expression hardening. "Is that what this is about? The company? Are you worried I'm not running it the way your precious family would approve of?" "This is about integrity," I replied evenly. "Something you clearly know nothing about." "Integrity?" he scoffed. "That's rich coming from someone who's been playing puppet master behind the scenes. You gave me that position, Elena. You put me in charge. And now you're upset that I'm actually making decisions?" "I put you in charge because I trusted you," I corrected him. "Because I believed in your talent and your vision. That trust was clearly misplaced." Nathan's jaw tightened. "So what now? You're going to take it all away? Push me out of my own company?" "Your company?" I laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "You still don't get it, do you? It was never yours to begin with." The tension in the room was suffocating. Olivia looked between us, her expression a mixture of distress and dawning comprehension. Whatever fairy tale Nathan had spun for her was unraveling before her eyes. "I think," she said quietly, "that you two need to talk privately. I'll be upstairs." After she left, Nathan's composed facade crumbled. "What the hell are you doing, Elena? Are you trying to ruin everything I've built?" "Everything you've built?" I repeated, incredulous. "Nathan, you've built nothing. You've been playing CEO with my company, my family's legacy, while I stood back and let you take the credit." "That was your choice," he shot back. "You were the one who wanted to focus on your other business interests. You were the one who suggested I take over the day-to-day operations. And you were the one who promised to honor that trust," I reminded him. "Instead, you've been cutting corners, compromising our reputation, and apparently using your position to seduce a series of assistants." He flinched at that. "Olivia was different. It wasn't planned. Nothing ever is with you, is it?" I observed coldly. "It just happens. No choices made, no responsibility taken." Nathan ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. "What do you want from me, Elena?" I considered the question carefully. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Some kind of twisted closure? The answer came to me with perfect clarity. "I want you to experience consequences," I said simply. "For once in your charmed life, I want you to face the results of your actions without someone else cleaning up your mess." "And what does that mean, exactly?" His voice held a note of wariness now. I smiled, the expression not reaching my eyes. "It means as of tomorrow morning, your executive authority at Morgan Architectural Innovations will be significantly reduced. All financial decisions will require board approval, a board that now includes Veronica and 2 other members of my choosing. Your compensation package will be restructured to align with industry standards rather than the generous arrangement I previously allowed." "You can't do that," he protested, but the uncertainty in his voice suggested he knew I absolutely could. "I already have," I informed him. "The paperwork was filed this afternoon." "Oh, and the Morgan name?" "It will remain attached to the company, but your name will be removed from all corporate materials moving forward. After all, you're not actually a Morgan." The color drained from his face. "You're erasing me." "Not erasing," I corrected. "Simply repositioning you to reflect reality. You'll retain your position as an architect. You do have talent after all, but without the inflated title and authority you've been enjoying." Nathan stared at me, a mixture of shock and something close to respect crossing his features. "I never thought you had this in you." "That," I said quietly, "was your first mistake." I moved past him toward the stairs, pausing before I left the room. "And Nathan? We should discuss divorce terms soon. I think we've both outgrown this particular arrangement, don't you?" That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted from my shoulders. The next morning brought a strange new reality. Breakfast with my husband's pregnant mistress, while said husband skulked around the periphery of his own home, uncertain of his place or his future. Olivia approached me as I was preparing to leave for a meeting with my legal team. "I want you to know," she said hesitantly, "that I've started looking for somewhere else to stay. After everything you told me, I can't keep imposing on your kindness." I studied her for a moment, this young woman caught in Nathan's web just as I had been years ago. The difference was that she still had a chance to extricate herself before he could cause any more damage. "Actually," I said, making a decision, "that surprised even me. I'd prefer if you stayed, at least until after the baby is born." Her eyes widened. "Why would you want that?" "Because despite everything, I take responsibility for the people connected to me, even when that connection is unconventional." I adjusted my scarf, avoiding her gaze. "Besides, I'm curious to see how Nathan handles actual accountability for once." "You're using me to teach him a lesson," she realized, not accusatory, but simply stating a fact. I smiled. "Slightly. I'm using this situation to ensure everyone gets what they deserve, including you and your child." "And what do we deserve?" she asked quietly. "Security," I replied without hesitation. "Stability. A future that doesn't depend on Nathan Morgan's empty promises." As I drove to my lawyer's office, I considered the strange path my life had taken. A week ago, I had been a wife betrayed, a businesswoman undermined, a woman whose life was being systematically dismantled from within. Now I was reclaiming my power piece by piece, in my company, in my home, in my very identity. The offices of Harrington and Associates occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown high-rise. Rebecca Harrington, my attorney for over a decade, was waiting for me in her corner office with a pot of tea and a stack of documents. "You've been busy," she observed as I settled into the chair across from her. "Corporate restructuring, marital dissolution, and now this trust for an unborn child? Most people would take these life changes one at a time." "I've never been particularly patient," I admitted, accepting the cup of tea she offered. "Once I see what needs to be done, I prefer to act decisively." Rebecca nodded, spreading the documents between us. "Let's start with the company changes. The board restructuring is complete, and Nathan's revised employment contract is ready for presentation. Are you sure about the terms? They're significantly less favorable than his current arrangement. I'm sure, I confirmed. He'll still be well compensated for his actual contributions, just not for the authority and ownership he never truly had. And the divorce? She tapped another folder. The prenuptial agreement you signed gives him considerably less than he might be expecting. The prenup stands, I said firmly. Nathan signed it willingly, fully aware of its terms. The fact that he never bothered to understand my family's holdings or corporate structures isn't my responsibility. Rebecca's lips curved in a small smile. And finally, the trust for the child. This is unusually generous, Elena, given the circumstances. I looked down at the document outlining the financial provisions I had designed for Olivia's baby. Educational, funds, healthcare coverage, a nest egg that would ensure financial security regardless of what happened between the adults in its life. The child is innocent in all this, I said quietly. And despite everything, it will still be connected to the Morgan name through Nathan. I want to ensure it has every advantage, including protection from its father's more self-destructive tendencies. And Olivia? Rebecca asked, her tone carefully neutral. You mentioned housing arrangements? I'm transferring ownership of the lake house to her, I explained. It's removed enough to give her privacy, but close enough to the city for practical matters. It needs some renovation, but that can be arranged before the baby arrives. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying me with the shrewd assessment that had made her one of the city's most sought-after attorneys. You know, most women in your position would be focused solely on punishing the husband and the mistress. Your approach is unconventional. I sipped my tea, considering her observation. Punishment is reactive. Strategic realignment is proactive. I'm not interested in revenge for its own sake. I'm interested in justice, in rebalancing what was unbalanced. And Nathan? What does justice look like for him? I set my cup down, my fingers tracing the delicate porcelain rim. For Nathan, justice is simple. The truth. No more pretending, no more inflated importance. No more leveraging my family's name and resources to feed his ego. He'll face exactly who he is. Nothing more, nothing less. As we finalized the paperwork, a strange calm settled over me. For years, I had allowed Nathan to take center stage. In our marriage, in the company, in our social circle, I had stepped back, believing that his ambition needed room to grow. That partnership meant supporting his dreams even when they overshadowed my own. But no more. The woman who left Rebecca's office that day was not the same one who had entered. Or perhaps she was the woman I had always been, just hidden beneath layers of compromise and misplaced loyalty. Either way, as I stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the dust settled on this chapter of my life, I would still be standing, stronger, clearer, and finally, unapologetically myself. The company's reaction to my return was swift and electric. News travels quickly in corporate environments, especially when it involves power shifts at the highest levels. By the time I arrived at Morgan Architectural Innovations the next morning, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. Employees who had barely acknowledged me during my occasional visits now straightened as I passed, offering respectful nods and careful smiles. The security guard who had always checked my ID despite knowing exactly who I was now, hurried to hold the door open. Good morning, Mrs. Morgan," the receptionist greeted me, a nervous tremor in her voice. "Your new office is ready, as requested." I smiled, noting the "your" rather than "the," a subtle but significant shift in perspective. "Thank you, Angela. Has Mr. Morgan arrived yet?" "No, ma'am," she replied, glancing anxiously at her computer screen. "He hasn't checked in this morning." "I see." I wasn't surprised. Nathan had left the house before dawn, avoiding the awkward breakfast scenario that had become our new normal. "When he arrives, please ask him to join me immediately." I made my way to what had once been my grandfather's office, the one Nathan had redecorated and claimed as his own. Overnight, it had been transformed back to something closer to its original state. The sleek modern desk had been replaced with the antique mahogany piece that had been in my family for generations. The walls, previously adorned with Nathan's awards and press features, now displayed the original architectural drawings of my grandfather's most iconic buildings, alongside my father's innovations and a few of my own early designs. It wasn't about erasing Nathan, it was about restoring context. About reminding everyone, including myself, of the legacy that had been temporarily obscured but never truly diminished. Veronica was waiting for me inside, a tablet in her hands and determination in her eyes. The executive team is gathering. In the conference room for the 9 o'clock meeting. Attendance is complete. I noted her emphasis on the word. Including the project managers Nathan has been keeping isolated from the main operations? She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Including them, some seemed quite relieved to be invited, actually. I imagine they were. I settled, behind the desk, feeling the weight of family history in the smooth wood beneath my fingertips. And the Westbrook Foundation? I've arranged for a meeting later this week. They're cautiously optimistic about the change in leadership, but want assurances that the original design elements will be restored. They'll have more than assurances, I promised. I want a complete redesign proposal that not only restores the original sustainability features but enhances them. Let's show them what Morgan Architectural Innovations was always meant to be. Veronica made a note on her tablet, then hesitated. And Nathan? What role should he play in this? I considered the question carefully. Despite everything, Nathan was a talented architect. His design instincts, when not compromised by cost-cutting measures or ego, were often brilliant. That talent was what had first drawn me to him, both personally and professionally. Nathan will remain on the Westbrook project team, I decided, but he'll report to Mira Chen as project lead. Her sustainability expertise is exactly what we need right now. Veronica raised an eyebrow. He won't like answering to someone who was previously his subordinate. Probably not, I agreed, unconcerned. But Mira deserves the recognition, and Nathan deserves the lesson in humility. Besides, working under her direction might remind him why he became an architect in the first place, before he got distracted by corner offices and executive titles. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. It wasn't Nathan, as I had half expected, but Alan Hargrove, the company's longtime chief financial officer, and, I had recently discovered, one of Nathan's closest allies in the corporate restructuring that had gradually marginalized my involvement. Elena, he greeted me with forced casualness, as if finding me in this office was a mild surprise rather than a seismic shift. I heard you were taking a more active role in operations. I thought we might discuss the quarterly projections before the executive meeting. I smiled pleasantly. Alan? Perfect timing. Please come in. He entered cautiously, nodding to Veronica, who remained expressionless but watchful. I've been reviewing the financial records from the past 18 months. I began without preamble. Specifically, the allocation of resources across our major projects and the bonus structure that was implemented without board approval last September. Alan's expression didn't change, but a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his discomfort. The bonus structure was presented in the quarterly financial summary. It was standard procedure. Buried on page 74 of a 90-page document with no specific call-out for board review, I corrected him. That's not standard procedure, Alan. That's deliberate obscuration. He shifted his weight, his casual demeanor slipping. Nathan approved. Nathan didn't have the authority to approve a compensation restructuring that increased executive bonuses by 40% while reducing project budgets by nearly the same amount. I cut in, my voice remaining calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. And you, as CFO, knew that. Alan's face paled slightly. Elena, you have to understand the competitive landscape we're operating in. To retain top talent. By top talent, do you mean the executive team that receives these bonuses, or the architects and designers whose projects have been systematically under-resourced to fund them? I asked, though we both knew the answer. Veronica took this as her cue, sliding a folder across the desk toward Alan. The board has unanimously approved a return to the previous compensation structure, effective immediately. You'll find the details inside, along with the updated reporting requirements to ensure proper oversight moving forward. Alan stared at the folder as if it might bite him. This is extremely unusual, he protested weakly. Mid-year compensation adjustments are perfectly appropriate when correcting improperly authorized changes, I finished for him. The legal department has already reviewed and approved the rollback. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Alan, I value your financial expertise. You've been with this company since my father's time, but I need to know that your loyalty is to Morgan Architectural Innovations as an institution, not to any individual within it. He met my gaze finally, something like respect reluctantly dawning in his expression. I've always acted in what I believe to be the company's best interests. Then we won't have any problems moving forward, I said, rising from my chair to indicate our discussion was concluded. I'll see you at the executive meeting. After Alan left, Veronica let out a low whistle. That was impressively restrained. I half expected you to fire him on the spot. That would be reactionary, I replied, gathering my materials for the upcoming meeting. Alan is valuable when properly directed. Besides, this isn't about punishing everyone who aligned with Nathan. It's about correcting the course of the company itself. Speaking of Nathan, Veronica nodded toward the doorway, where my husband had finally appeared, his usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, as if he'd dressed in a hurry. His eyes took in the transformed office, lingering on the family photographs now adorning the credenza behind my desk. Images spanning 4 generations of Morgan architects, including the one of my grandfather breaking ground on his first major commission, my father's graduation from architecture school, and me at 12, proudly displaying a model building I had constructed. Redecorating already? Nathan asked, his attempt at nonchalance undermined by the tightness in his voice. That was fast. Just restoring some historical context, I replied evenly. Something that seems to have been overlooked recently. He stepped further into the office, hands shoved into his pockets. I got a call from Mira Chen this morning. She seems to think she's leading the Westbrook project now. She is, I confirmed. Her environmental design expertise makes her the ideal choice to restore the sustainability elements that were removed from the original plans. Nathan's jaw tightened. I removed those elements because they were driving the project over budget. No, I corrected him. You removed them to increase the profit margin, which directly impacted your bonus calculation. The client specifically prioritized those features and allocated budget for them. Their removal wasn't a financial necessity. It was a choice you made to benefit yourself at the expense of the project's integrity. He had the grace to look somewhat abashed, though. Resentment still simmered beneath the surface. So that's how it's going to be? You're going to second-guess every decision I've made? Not every decision, I assured him. Just the ones that compromised our company's values, client relationships, and reputation for excellence. Nathan glanced at Veronica, clearly uncomfortable having this conversation with an audience. Sensing this, she discreetly excused herself, though not before giving me a supportive nod on her way out. Once we were alone, Nathan's carefully maintained facade crumbled slightly. What happened to you, Elena? When did you become this calculating? I almost laughed at the irony. I've always been calculating, Nathan. How do you think my family built this company? The difference is, I used to calculate in your favor. And now? he asked quietly. Now I'm calculating in favor of what matters: the company, its legacy, the people who work here. I gathered my portfolio, preparing to head to the executive meeting. Your place in that equation depends entirely on you. He followed me as I moved toward the door. And what about us? Our marriage? I stopped, turning to face him fully. Our marriage ended the moment you brought your pregnant secretary into our home, Nathan. The rest is just paperwork. Pain flickered across his face, genuine pain that momentarily caught me off guard. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and manipulation, there had been real feeling between us once. Perhaps there still was, buried beneath layers of resentment and broken trust. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said, a plea in his voice that tugged at something deep inside me. A memory of happier times, of shared dreams, of the man I had once believed him to be. For a brief, disconcerting moment, I felt my resolve waver. Then I remembered Olivia, pregnant and vulnerable, building her hopes on Nathan's empty promises. I remembered the architectural designs compromised for profit, the talented employees, overlooked for promotion while Nathan's friends advanced. I remembered the careful, systematic way he had pushed me into the background of my own family's legacy. But it did happen, Nathan, I said finally. And now we all have to live with the consequences. I left him standing in what had once been his office, now transformed into a space that honored the past while acknowledging the present, exactly what I intended for the company as a whole. The executive meeting that followed was a masterclass in professional recalibration. I didn't need to make grand pronouncements or dramatic displays of authority. Simply by taking my rightful seat at the head of the table, by speaking with quiet confidence about the company's renewed direction, I established a presence that required no explanation or justification. Nathan sat halfway down the table, his usual commanding position at the opposite end, now occupied by Veronica. He said little throughout the meeting, his expression alternating between resignation and calculation as he watched the power dynamics shift around him. By the end of that first day back in the office, word had spread throughout the company. Elena Morgan was not just the owner on paper. She was the leader in practice. The response was overwhelmingly positive, especially from the design teams, whose creative visions had been repeatedly compromised by budget constraints that, they now learned, had been unnecessary. As I drove home that evening, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. For years, I had convinced myself that stepping back from the company was a choice, a delegation of authority that freed me to pursue other interests. Now, I recognized it for what it truly was, a gradual surrender of identity, not just professionally but personally as well. The house was quiet when I arrived, the usual sounds of Nathan's evening routine, news playing in the background, ice clinking. In a whiskey glass, conspicuously absent. Instead, I found Olivia in the kitchen, awkwardly attempting to prepare dinner. "You don't have to do that," I said, setting my briefcase on the counter and removing my suit jacket. She jumped slightly, turning from the cutting board where she had been massacring an onion. "I wanted to feel useful," she admitted. "And cooking seemed like, I don't know, something I could contribute." I took in the chaotic scene, vegetables scattered across the counter, a pot of water boiling furiously on the stove, a cookbook open to a complex pasta recipe that seemed well beyond her current culinary skills. "How about we order takeout instead?" I suggested gently. "And tomorrow I can show you some easier recipes to start with." Relief washed over her face. "That obvious, huh?" "Let's just say I recognize the ambitious first attempt of someone more accustomed to microwave meals," I replied with a small smile, remembering my own early cooking disasters after moving out of my parents' home. As we waited for the food to arrive, Olivia and I settled into what had become our strange new normal, a tentative companionship born of shared betrayal. Nathan called me today, she said, absently rubbing her growing baby bump. He sounded different. Different how? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She considered this, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Less confident? I guess. He asked about the baby, which he hasn't done much since. Well, since I moved in here. She paused, then added quietly, he also said I should ask you about the lake house. So Nathan had already heard about that. News traveled fast, especially when it involved property transfers and trust funds. I was planning to discuss it with you tomorrow, I said. But yes, I've arranged for you to have a place of your own before the baby arrives. Somewhere safe, comfortable, and beyond Nathan's financial control. Olivia stared at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. But why? After everything that's happened, why would you help me like this? It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly over the past few days. The answer that kept returning wasn't about charity or manipulation, or even some misplaced maternal instinct toward this young woman carrying my husband's child. It was simpler and more complex all at once. Because it's the right thing to do, I said finally. And because doing the right thing, especially when it's difficult, is how we maintain our integrity when others lose theirs. That's a very evolved perspective, she observed, a hint of suspicion in her voice. I laughed softly. Don't mistake it for sainthood. I'm angry, Olivia. Furious, actually. At Nathan, at the situation, and yes, sometimes at you too. But that anger doesn't entitle me to be cruel, especially not to someone who was manipulated, just as thoroughly as I was, albeit in different ways. She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're not just helping me. You're proving something to yourself. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Or perhaps I'm simply trying to break a cycle that would be all too easy to perpetuate. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of dinner. Expensive Thai food from the restaurant Nathan and I had frequented in happier times. As we ate, the conversation shifted to more practical matters. Olivia's upcoming doctor's appointments, the renovations needed at the lake house, the basics of financial management that she would need to navigate as a single mother. It struck me, as we discussed these mundane details, how thoroughly Nathan had failed both of us in different ways. He had betrayed my trust while simultaneously leaving Olivia woefully unprepared for the realities of parenthood. His promises to both women had been equally empty, though packaged differently. Nathan didn't return home that night. A text message arrived around 10, brief and impersonal. Staying at the Continental. Need time to think. I forwarded the message to Rebecca Harrington with a short note. Document the separation date for the divorce filing. Then, I turned off my phone and slept better than I had in weeks. The days that followed established a new rhythm. I divided my time between the office, where I was methodically assessing every aspect of the company's operations, and home, where Olivia and I had developed a strangely comfortable coexistence. Nathan remained at the hotel, coming to the office daily, but maintaining a careful distance from me both professionally and personally. On Friday afternoon, I met with the Westbrook Foundation board members to present our revised proposal. Mira, Chen led the presentation, her quiet confidence and deep expertise shining as she walked them through the enhanced sustainability features and innovative design elements that had been compromised in the previous iteration. Nathan sat in the back of the room, observing but not participating. I had insisted on his presence, not to humiliate him, but to demonstrate the company's unified commitment to correcting course. To his credit, he had accepted this diminished role without complaint, perhaps recognizing it as the professional penance it was. This is exactly what we envisioned when we selected Morgan Architectural Innovations, the Foundation's chairwoman said approvingly as Mira concluded the presentation. I'm curious, though, what prompted such a comprehensive revision at this stage of the project? All eyes turned to me, including Nathan's. This was the moment where I could have easily highlighted his failures, cementing my position by undermining his. Instead, I chose a different path. Morgan Architectural Innovations is undergoing a period of internal realignment, I explained smoothly. We're recommitting to the founding principles that have guided this firm for 3 generations: sustainability, integrity, and client-centered design. The revised proposal reflects those values, which should have been paramount from the beginning. The chairwoman nodded, satisfied with this diplomatic response. As the meeting concluded and contracts were updated, I felt Nathan's gaze on me, from across the room. When I finally met his eyes, I saw something unexpected. Gratitude, mingled with what might have been respect. That evening, as I was preparing to leave the office, Nathan appeared in my doorway, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Thank you," he said simply, "for what you did at the Westbrook meeting. You could have thrown me under the bus." I continued gathering my things, neither acknowledging nor dismissing his gratitude. It wouldn't have served any purpose except momentary satisfaction. Still, he stepped further into the office, maintaining a respectful distance. It showed. Class. I looked up at him then, really looked at him, seeing beyond the handsome features that had first attracted me to the man himself. Flawed, ambitious, talented, and now, perhaps, just beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. "Nathan," I said carefully, "I didn't build this company on petty revenge. I built it on excellence. The same excellence my grandfather demanded, and my father after him. Whatever is happening between us personally doesn't change that commitment." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot over the past few days. About us. About the company. About Olivia and the baby." I waited, sensing he had more to say. "I handled everything wrong," he continued, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture. "The affair, the pregnancy, the company, decisions. All of it. And I keep asking myself why. Why I risked everything good in my life for... what? Ego? Validation? Those are questions only you can answer," I replied, neither encouraging nor discouraging his self-reflection. "I know." He sighed heavily. "I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to figure it out, to be better somehow, even if it's too late for us." Something shifted within me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the first seedling of whatever might eventually grow in its place. "It is too late for us, Nathan, but it's not too late for you to be a good father to your child, or to be the architect I always believed you could be." He nodded, accepting this truth with a resignation that seemed genuine. "The lake house," he said after a moment, "for Olivia. That was generous." "It's not generosity," I corrected him. "It's responsibility. That child will always be connected to the Morgan name through you. I'm simply ensuring it has the stability and security every child deserves." "Our child would have had that too," he said quietly, "if we'd had one. I know I always put it off, said the timing wasn't right. I was scared, Elena. Scared I wouldn't measure up as a father the way I always felt I didn't quite measure up at the company." The revelation caught me off guard. All those years of waiting, of gentle hints and eventually resigned acceptance. I had interpreted his reluctance as career prioritization, never as fear or inadequacy. "You could have told me that," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I couldn't even admit it to myself," he replied. "It was easier to keep pushing it to some future date than to face what I was really afraid of." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what might have been settling between us. Not just the child we never had, but the honest partnership. That could have flourished if only we'd truly seen and understood each other. "I should go," I said finally, closing my briefcase with a decisive click. It's been a long week. Nathan stepped aside, allowing me to pass. As I reached the door, he spoke again. Elena, for what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for the affair, or the baby, but for taking you for granted. For not seeing what was right in front of me all along. I paused, my hand on the doorframe. I'm sorry too, Nathan, for allowing it to happen, for stepping back when I should have stepped forward. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation. But it was acknowledgement of shared responsibility, of mutual regret, of the complex truth that rarely fits into neat categories of victim and villain. As I drove home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the familiar streets. So much had changed in such a short time, yet something fundamental remained constant. My sense of purpose, of identity, of the values that had guided generations of Morgans before me. The house was quiet when I arrived. A note from Olivia on the counter explaining that she had gone to dinner with a friend from her former apartment building. I welcomed the solitude, kicking off my heels and pouring a glass of wine before settling onto the terrace that overlooked the city. My phone buzzed with a message from Veronica. The board approved all proposed changes unanimously. Morgan Architectural Innovations is officially back on track. I smiled, setting the phone aside and gazing out at the skyline dotted with buildings. My family had helped design over the decades. Some were my grandfather's stately stoneworks, others my father's sleek glass towers, and a few, just a few, that bore my own distinctive vision. There would be more now, many more. Not because I needed to prove anything to Nathan or to anyone else, but because creating beautiful, functional spaces was the Morgan legacy, my legacy. It had never truly belonged to anyone else, no matter how convincingly they had played the part. As the lights of the city began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. The path forward wasn't entirely clear yet. There were still decisions to be made, conversations to be had, wounds that might never fully heal. But I was no longer lost, no longer diminished by someone else's ambition or betrayal. I had reclaimed what was mine, not just the company, but something far more valuable, the certainty of who I was and what I stood for. In the end, that was the only ownership that truly mattered. The weekend brought an unexpected sense of normalcy, despite the extraordinary circumstances of my life. I spent Saturday morning reviewing architectural journals and industry publications, catching up on innovations and trends I had neglected during my self-imposed exile from the profession. The familiar rhythms of research and analysis soothed me, reconnecting me to the intellectual passion that had first drawn me to architecture as a child, watching my father at his drafting table. Around noon, Olivia appeared in the doorway of my home study, hesitant to interrupt but clearly seeking something. "Sorry to bother you," she said, one hand absently resting on her growing belly. "But I wondered if you might want to see the lake house today. I haven't been there yet, and I thought, well, I'd feel more comfortable if you came with me." The request surprised me. The lake house had been in my family for generations. A sprawling craftsman retreat nestled among pine trees, with panoramic views of the water and mountains beyond. It was where I had spent childhood summers learning to swim and sail, where my parents had hosted legendary 4th of July gatherings for employees and clients. It held memories both precious and painful, which was perhaps why I had visited less frequently in recent years. "Of course," I agreed, setting aside my journals. "It's been a while since I've been there myself. We should check what renovations might be needed before you move in." The drive took nearly an hour, winding through increasingly rural landscapes until we reached the private road that led to the property. Beside me, Olivia grew quiet as the house came into view. Timber and stone rising organically from the surrounding forest, large windows reflecting the afternoon light. "It's beautiful," she murmured as we parked in the gravel driveway. "When you said lake house, I imagined something. Smaller. I smiled, remembering my own childhood awe at the scale of the place. My grandfather believed in building to last. This was his first major personal project, a laboratory for ideas he would later incorporate into his commercial designs. As we walked through the rooms, I found myself sharing stories about the house and its history. The massive stone fireplace my grandfather had constructed using rocks gathered from the property. The reading nook where my grandmother would sit for hours with her novels. The kitchen where my father had taught me to make his famous blueberry pancakes. Olivia listened attentively, trailing her fingers along wooden banisters and built-in shelves with a reverence that spoke to her understanding of what this place meant. "I can't believe you're giving this to me," she said finally, as we stood on the deck overlooking the lake. "It should stay in your family." The statement hung in the air between us, laden with unspoken complications. Technically, through the child she carried, this place would remain connected to the Morgan name, if not the bloodline. The thought prompted a question I had been avoiding. "Have you and Nathan discussed names for the baby?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Her hand moved protectively to her stomach. "Not really. He hasn't been very involved in those kinds of details." She hesitated, then added, "I was thinking of James for a boy after my grandfather. For a girl, maybe Sophia." "Those are lovely names," I said sincerely. "Strong, classic." "Not Morgan?" she asked with surprising directness. I thought that might be expected, given everything. I turned to face her fully, recognizing the importance of this moment. "Olivia, whatever arrangement you and Nathan eventually make regarding parenting, there's something you should understand about names, especially the Morgan name." She watched me curiously, waiting. "A name isn't just a label," I continued. "It's an inheritance, a responsibility." My grandfather used to tell me that every building bearing the Morgan name represented a promise to its occupants. A promise of safety, functionality, beauty. That principle extended to how we conducted ourselves in business and in life. I gestured toward the house behind us. This place, everything I've worked for, everything I've built, it all began with that understanding that the name Morgan meant something. Whether your child carries that name should depend on whether Nathan is prepared to instill those values, to live up to that responsibility himself. Olivia nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I never thought about it that way. Names, as with legacies. They can be," I agreed, "or they can be just names. The choice is yours, and Nathan's." The subject shifted after that, to more practical matters of furniture and decorating, which rooms might become a nursery, what repairs were most urgent. As we walked the property, Olivia grew increasingly animated, her initial hesitation giving way to genuine excitement about transforming this space into a home for herself and her child. It was strange, watching another woman imagine her future in a place so deeply intertwined with my past. Stranger still was the absence of resentment I felt. Instead, there was something almost like satisfaction in knowing this house would again be filled with life, with purpose. We were preparing to leave when Olivia paused by the car, her face suddenly serious. "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded, curiosity piqued. "Do you regret it? Marrying Nathan?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was inappropriate. We were well past conventional boundaries of politeness, but because I hadn't fully articulated the answer even to myself. "No," I said after careful consideration. "I don't regret it. There were good years, important ones. I learned things about myself, about relationships, about compromise. Sometimes too much compromise." I looked back at the house, at the mountains beyond. What I regret is losing sight of myself along the way. That's a mistake I won't repeat. Olivia's expression softened with understanding. "For what it's worth, she said quietly. "I think the woman you are now is extraordinary. I hope someday I can be that strong, that clear about who I am." The compliment was unexpected, her sincerity disarming. In that moment, I saw Olivia not as the other woman, not as Nathan's mistake or my problem to solve, but simply as a young woman standing at the threshold of profound change, trying to find her footing on shifting ground. Not so different from me in many ways. "You're stronger than you realize," I told her. "And clarity comes with practice, with making choices that honor your values, even when they're difficult." The drive back to the city was companionable, our conversation ranging from Olivia's childhood in a small Midwestern town to her abandoned dreams of graphic design, a passion she had set aside when practical considerations of steady employment pushed her toward business administration instead. "You should revisit that," I suggested as we neared home. "Graphic design, I mean. Morgan Architectural Innovations has an entire department dedicated to visual communications, everything from project presentations to marketing materials. We even have a tuition assistance program for employees pursuing related education." She glanced at me, surprise evident in her expression. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," I clarified. "When you're ready, after the baby, when you've settled in, a chance to build something for yourself, independent of Nathan or me or anyone else." Tears welled in her eyes, quickly blinked away. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because talent shouldn't be wasted," I said simply. "And because everyone deserves the chance to create their own legacy." When we arrived home, Nathan's car was in the driveway, the first time he had returned to the house since moving to the hotel. He was sitting in the living room, an overnight bag at his feet, clearly waiting for us. His eyes widened slightly as we entered together, clearly not having expected us to arrive as a unit. "You're back," I observed neutrally, setting my purse on the entry table. "Just to pick up some more clothes," he explained, standing awkwardly. "I didn't realize you'd both be out." "We went to see the lake house," Olivia offered, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach in what I had come to recognize as a protective gesture. Nathan's gaze shifted between us, clearly struggling to reconcile the image of his wife and his pregnant mistress spending time together by choice. "The lake house," he repeated. "Right." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. This was the first time the three of us had been together since the night I had revealed the truth about the company, and the dynamic was undeniably strange. A triangle of complicated emotions and shared history. "I should rest," Olivia said finally, sensing the tension. "Doctor's orders. Thank you for today, Elena. It was illuminating." She disappeared upstairs, leaving Nathan and me alone in the cavernous living room that had once been the backdrop for our shared life. Dinner parties for clients, quiet evenings with books and wine, heated discussions about projects and designs and possibilities. "You took her to the lake house," Nathan said once Olivia was out of earshot, his tone carefully modulated to hide whatever he was truly feeling. "The same lake house where we spent our honeymoon." "Yes," I confirmed, seeing no reason to pretend otherwise. "She needs a place to live, a stable environment for the child. The lake house has been sitting empty for years." He nodded slowly, his expression distant. "I remember how much you loved that place. The stories you told me about summers there with your grandfather, learning to sail, helping him measure for renovations. It meant everything to you." "It did," I acknowledged, moving to the window that overlooked the garden. "But it's just a house, Nathan. The memories, the lessons, the values it represents, those I keep. The physical structure itself is transferable." "Like me?" he asked quietly. I turned to face him, surprised by the vulnerability in his question. "No, Nathan. You weren't transferable. You were my husband, my partner, or so I believed. That's why your betrayal cut so deep. Not just the affair or the pregnancy, but The way you systematically pushed me out of my own company, my own legacy. You tried to replace me in every aspect of my life." He flinched, the truth of my words clearly hitting home. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "In my mind, I was building something for us, for our future." "Were you?" I challenged. "Or were you building a narrative where you were the visionary, the creator, the driving force, and I was just the fortunate beneficiary of your brilliance? Be honest, at least now." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. "Slightly. Maybe there's some truth to that," he conceded. "I always felt like I was living in the shadow of the Morgan name. Your grandfather's reputation, your father's innovations, your family's wealth and connections. Everything I achieved seemed borrowed somehow, not really mine." "So you tried to make it yours," I concluded, "by removing me from the equation entirely." "Not consciously," he protested. "But yes, looking back. I wanted to prove I deserved my position, that I had earned it through talent and vision, not just by marrying the boss's daughter." There was a painful honesty in his admission that caught me off guard. Throughout our marriage, Nathan had always projected absolute confidence, unwavering self-assurance. This glimpse of his insecurity, his need for validation, humanized him in a way that complicated my carefully constructed narrative. "You never needed to prove anything to me," I said softly. "I married you because I believed in your talent, your passion. I gave you a position at the company for the same reason." "I know that now," he replied, regret evident in his voice. Too late, apparently. I studied him, this man I had once loved deeply enough to share everything with. There was a difference in him now, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. The crisis of the past weeks had stripped away his polished facade, revealing something more authentic beneath. "It's too late for our marriage," I confirmed. "But not necessarily too late for you to become the architect, the man you're capable of being. That choice remains yours." Nathan nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And Olivia? The baby? How do they fit into all this?" "That depends on what kind of father you want to be," I said. "What kind of example you want to set. The lake house provides financial security and stability for them, but only you can provide the emotional support and presence that child will need." He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "You've thought of everything, haven't you? Arranged all the pieces on the board while I was still reeling from the first move." "That's not a game analogy I would choose," I replied. "This isn't about winning or losing, Nathan. It's about creating the best possible outcome from a situation none of us would have chosen." "Even for me?" he asked skeptically. "You're planning for my best outcome too?" I considered this question carefully. "I'm planning for an outcome where you have the opportunity to be your best self. Whether you take that opportunity is up to you." Nathan gathered his overnight bag, slinging it over his shoulder with a weariness that seemed bone deep. "I don't deserve your consideration after what I've done." "This isn't about what you deserve," I told him honestly. "It's about who I choose to be, regardless of your actions." A small, sad smile crossed his face. "I think I'm only now beginning to understand what I'm losing," he said quietly. "Not just a wife or a position, but the chance to be part of something. Honorable." He moved toward the door, then paused. "The divorce papers. Your lawyer sent them to mine yesterday." "Yes," I confirmed. "The terms are fair. More than fair, according to Rebecca." "I won't contest anything," he assured me. "Whatever you've outlined, I'll accept." This easy capitulation surprised me. I had expected at least some negotiation, some attempt to leverage his years with the company into a more substantial settlement. "That's surprisingly straightforward of you." Nathan shrugged, a gesture that carried the weight of resignation. Fighting you would just be another way of denying responsibility, he said. I'm trying not to do that anymore. After he left, I remained in the living room, watching as twilight descended over the garden. Nathan's unexpected self-awareness had unsettled me, disrupting the clean narrative of betrayal and consequences I had constructed. It was easier when I could view him simply as selfish and opportunistic. This emerging complexity demanded a more nuanced response. My phone buzzed with a message from Veronica. Drinks tomorrow? You sound like you need to decompress. I smiled, grateful for her perceptiveness. Absolutely. My house, 7 p.m. Bring the good scotch. The following evening, Veronica arrived promptly at 7, a bottle of 25-year-old Macallan in hand and determination in her stride. Olivia had gone to dinner with a former colleague, giving us the house to ourselves, a much-needed opportunity for unfiltered conversation. You look better than expected, Veronica observed as she settled onto the terrace lounge chair. Given the circumstances. I handed her a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the light of the setting sun. Surprisingly, I feel better than expected. There's something clarifying about crisis. That's one word for it, she replied dryly. I would have gone with catastrophic or apocalyptic, but clarifying works too. I laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Don't get me wrong. There are moments when I want to set everything on fire and walk away. But mostly, I feel like I'm finally seeing things as they really are, not as I wished them to be. Veronica nodded, taking a thoughtful sip of her scotch, like Nathan's true character. Yes, I agreed, but also my own. How complicit I was in creating the dynamic that led us here. She frowned, setting her glass down firmly. Hold on. Are you seriously blaming yourself for your husband's affair? Because if so, I need to pour a much stronger drink. Not the affair, I clarified. But the professional situation, the way I allowed myself to be sidelined in my own company, that was partly my doing. I stepped back, convinced myself it was a choice when really it was. Surrender. Veronica considered this, her sharp legal mind parsing the distinction. Fair enough. But let's be clear. His personal betrayal is entirely on him. Agreed, I said, raising my glass in a small toast. And speaking of Nathan, he came by yesterday to pick up some things. We had an interesting conversation. I recounted our exchange, including Nathan's unexpected admissions about his insecurities and his decision not to contest the divorce terms. Veronica listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. Well, she said finally, people can surprise you, I suppose. Not necessarily in good ways, but surprise nonetheless. Indeed, I murmured. The question now is whether this apparent self-awareness is genuine or just another performance. Time will tell, Veronica replied pragmatically. Actions over words, as always. She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. But, Elena, whatever growth Nathan may or may not be experiencing, don't let it cloud your judgment. The company is stabilizing under your leadership. The divorce terms are advantageous. Your position is secure. Don't risk that for sentimentality. I'm not, I assured her. The divorce proceeds as planned. The company reorganization continues. Nothing has changed on that front. Good. She refilled our glasses, satisfaction evident in her expression. Now, tell me about this arrangement with Olivia. The lake house, the potential job offer. I'm trying to understand the strategy there. I smiled at her assumption that every decision was tactical. It was the lawyer in her, always looking for the angle, the advantage. It's not a strategy, Veronica. It's simply the right thing to do. She arched a skeptical eyebrow. The right thing for whom? This woman slept with your husband, is carrying his child, And you're setting her up with property and employment? That's not standard wronged wife behavior. Perhaps that's the problem, I suggested. The standard response would be to vilify Olivia, to punish her alongside Nathan, but she's not the villain here, at least not the primary one. She's young, she was manipulated, and now she's facing single motherhood with limited resources. So you're, what, adopting her? Veronica asked, half joking. I shook my head, smiling slightly at the absurdity of the situation. I'm acknowledging the reality that she and her child will always be connected to me through Nathan, through the Morgan name. I can either make that connection adversarial or make it functional. Veronica studied me for a long moment, her expression softening. You know what's truly impressive about all this? It's not the strategic brilliance, though that's considerable. It's your fundamental decency. Lesser people would have scorched the earth. Lesser people don't have as much to lose, I replied simply, or as much responsibility to uphold. Our conversation shifted to company matters after that. The progress on restructuring key departments, the positive client responses to our renewed focus on design integrity, the talent we were attracting now that word had spread about the changes at Morgan Architectural Innovations. By the time Veronica left, the night air had grown cool and my perspective had clarified further. Her pragmatic assessment had reinforced my confidence in the path I had chosen, not just for the company, but for myself personally. The following Monday brought unexpected news. Nathan had requested a meeting with the executive team to present a comprehensive analysis of the company's design evolution over the past decade, identifying where we had strayed from our founding principles and suggesting paths for realignment. He's been working on this all weekend, Mira Chen informed me, clearly impressed despite herself. I've never seen him so focused, so humble, honestly. He's actually listening to the design team's input instead of just directing. I took in this information with measured optimism. One weekend of reformed behavior didn't erase years of questionable decisions, but it was a promising indication that Nathan's expressed desire to change might be genuine. The presentation itself was remarkable, thorough, insightful, and refreshingly honest about the compromises that had been made for financial expediency. Nathan stood before the executive team not as the confident, charismatic leader he had once portrayed, but as a thoughtful professional acknowledging past errors and proposing constructive solutions. The Morgan legacy has always been about balancing innovation with responsibility, he concluded, his gaze briefly meeting mine across the conference table. Somewhere along the way, that balance shifted, and with it, our core identity as a firm. This analysis isn't meant as criticism of any individual, but rather as a collective call to return to the principles that made this company exceptional in the first place. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Even Alan Hargrove, who had been notably cool toward Nathan since the leadership transition, nodded approvingly. This is exactly the kind of self-assessment we need, he acknowledged, particularly as we approach the firm's 60th anniversary next year. As the meeting dispersed, Nathan remained behind, clearly hoping to speak with me privately. I gestured for him to stay, curious about what had prompted this apparent transformation. That was impressive work, I said once we were alone, especially given the time frame. Thank you, he replied, his usual confidence tempered with something new. Humility, perhaps. I've been thinking about what you said, about becoming the architect I'm capable of being. This felt like a step in that direction. I studied him, looking for signs of calculation or performance, but found only sincerity. It was a substantial step. The question is whether it represents a moment of insight or a genuine change in approach. I'm hoping to prove the latter, he said quietly. Not to win you back or regain my former position. I know those ships have sailed, but because I need to know I can be better than my worst mistakes. His vulnerability was disarming, reminiscent of the man I had first fallen in love with, passionate about architecture, earnest in his aspirations, unafraid to acknowledge his limitations. I found myself wanting to believe in this version of Nathan, even as caution held me back. Actions over time, I reminded him. That's the only proof that matters. He nodded, accepting this without protest. Fair enough. I should mention, I've been talking with Olivia about the baby, about what kind of father I want to be. I'm planning to visit the lake house this weekend to help with some of the renovations. This surprised me. That's proactive of you. It's the least I can do, he said, literally the very least. But it's a start. As he gathered his presentation materials, Nathan paused, something clearly still on his mind. Elena, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but there is one thing I've been wondering. Yes? I prompted when he hesitated. The cabin in Colorado, he said. The one we designed together but never built. The plans you drew up during our first year of marriage for that piece of land in the mountains. I remembered it well. A modern interpretation of a traditional mountain lodge, with expansive windows to capture the dramatic views, sustainable features integrated seamlessly into the design. It had been a labor of love, a shared vision of a retreat where we might someday spend winters designing and summers hiking. We had purchased the land, but construction had been repeatedly delayed as Nathan's career took precedence. What about it? I asked, unsure where he was going with this. I was hoping you might consider building it, he said. Not for us, obviously, but for yourself. It was brilliant design work, some of your best. It deserves to exist in the world, not just in blueprints. The suggestion caught me off guard. That design had represented a future we had planned together, a tangible embodiment of our partnership. The thought of building it now, alone, had never occurred to me. I'll think about it, I said finally, neither committing nor dismissing the idea. Nathan nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. That's all I ask. Thank you for hearing me out today. After he left, I remained in the conference room, turning over this unexpected suggestion in my mind. The cabin plans were indeed special, innovative yet deeply personal, technically challenging yet emotionally resonant. Building it now would transform its meaning, reclaiming it as a statement of my individual vision rather than our shared one. The thought was both daunting and oddly liberating. That evening, I found myself pulling the old drawings from my home office files, spreading them across my desk and rediscovering details I had forgotten. The cantilevered deck that seemed to float above the valley below, the central fireplace constructed of local stone, the studio space oriented to capture the northern light perfect for drafting. As I traced the lines with my fingertips, I realized Nathan had given me something unexpected, permission to reclaim yet another piece of myself I had set aside. This one a creative vision I had shelved when our shared future began to take a different shape than the one we had initially imagined. Olivia found me still poring over the plans hours later, completely absorbed in the technical challenges of adapting the design to incorporate newer sustainable technologies that hadn't been available when I first conceived it. These are beautiful, she said, studying the elevations with an artist's appreciation. Did you design this? Yes, I replied, suddenly self-conscious about my obvious enthusiasm. A long time ago, for a piece of land in Colorado, it was never built. But you're reconsidering it now, she observed, noting the new sketches and calculations scattered among the original plans. I nodded, somewhat surprised by my own decision. I think I am, with some updates and refinements. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. Good. You light up when you talk about design? Did you know that? It's like watching someone step into their element. Her observation was startlingly accurate. I had felt more alive in the past few hours, immersed in creative problem-solving, than I had in longer than I could remember. The sensation was both familiar and new, like returning to a beloved childhood home and finding it both exactly as remembered and wonderfully different. "Thank you for noticing," I said, meaning it sincerely. As Olivia withdrew to give me privacy, I turned back to the plans with renewed clarity. This cabin would be built, but not as originally conceived, not as a retreat for a couple whose partnership had failed, but as a statement of individual vision, of reclamation, of moving forward rather than looking back. I began to sketch new elements: a larger studio space, a bedroom that could be converted to accommodate guests, a more expansive kitchen reflective of my growing interest in culinary exploration. This would be my place, designed for my life as it was now and as I wanted it to be. For the first time since Nathan had brought Olivia into our home, since discovering his betrayal, his deception, his systematic undermining of my position, I felt something unexpected bloom within me. Not just determination or righteous anger, but genuine excitement for the future. My future, shaped by my choices, reflective of my values. The Morgan legacy would continue, not just through the company or through Nathan's unborn child, but through the work of my own hands, the vision of my own mind. That was a kind of ownership no one could ever take from me, and the realization filled me with a profound sense of peace. Spring gave way to early summer, bringing longer days and renewed energy to the city. 3 months had passed since Nathan's revelation about Olivia, and in that time, the landscape of my life had shifted dramatically. The company was thriving under my direct leadership, with several major new commissions secured and a revitalized, creative culture taking root throughout the organization. The divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly, with Nathan maintaining his promise not to contest any terms. Most surprising was the evolution of my relationship with Olivia. What had begun as an impossible situation had gradually transformed into something resembling a tentative friendship. She was now settled in the lake house, the renovations nearly complete. Her pregnancy had progressed to the 7th month, her body changing in ways that occasionally caught me off guard when I visited, a stark physical reminder of her connection to Nathan, yet increasingly something I viewed as separate from that complicated history. On a warm Tuesday morning, I was reviewing the initial sketches for my Colorado cabin when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. "Dr. Margaret Chen is here to see you," she said, clearly puzzled by the unfamiliar name. "She says she's Olivia's obstetrician." Alarm immediately shot through me. "Send her in right away." Dr. Chen entered my office with brisk efficiency, her expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Morgan, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I'm Olivia Taylor's doctor." "Is something wrong?" I asked, rising from my desk. "Has there been an emergency?" "Not an emergency, no," she assured me, accepting the seat I offered. "But a concern that Olivia asked me to discuss with you directly. Her blood pressure has been consistently elevated at her last 3 appointments. Given her history and current circumstances, I've recommended modified bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy." I processed this information, trying to understand why Olivia's doctor was bringing this to me rather than to Nathan. "I appreciate you telling me this, Dr. Chen, but shouldn't Olivia's partner be the one?" "Olivia indicated that you are her primary support person," Dr. Chen interrupted gently. She was quite specific about that. The revelation caught me off guard. Despite our improved relationship, I had always assumed Nathan was more involved in Olivia's prenatal care than I was. "I see. What exactly does modified bed rest entail?" "Limited physical activity, reduced stress, frequent monitoring," Dr. Chen explained. "Ideally, someone should be checking in on her daily. The lake house is lovely but quite isolated. I understand Mr. Morgan visits on weekends, but that's not sufficient given the current concerns." I nodded, already mentally rearranging my schedule. "I'll make arrangements immediately. Would it be better for her to move back to the city temporarily?" I could set her up in the guest suite where she stayed before. Dr. Chen considered this. The lakeside environment is actually beneficial. Peaceful, good air quality. What she needs is consistent companionship and monitoring, not necessarily relocation. I understand, I said, decision already made. I'll handle it. After Dr. Chen left, I made a series of quick calls to Veronica, explaining I would be working remotely for the foreseeable future. To my assistant, instructing her to reschedule in-person meetings and prepare files for digital access. And finally to Nathan, who answered on the fourth ring. Elena? Is everything all right? His voice held genuine concern. Olivia's doctor just left my office, I said without preamble. She's been placed on modified bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. Blood pressure issues. Silence, then a sharp intake of breath. Why didn't she tell me? That's a question for Olivia, I replied neutrally. The immediate issue is that she needs daily monitoring, which isn't happening with your weekend-only visits. I can adjust my schedule, he said quickly. Take some time off. I've already made arrangements, I interrupted. I'll be working from the lake house for the next few weeks. I can monitor her condition while maintaining my responsibilities at the company. Another pause, longer this time. You would do that for her? The question carried layers of meaning. Surprise, gratitude, perhaps a hint of shame that I was stepping into a role he should have filled. I'm doing what's necessary, I said simply. She's carrying a child connected to the Morgan family. That makes her well-being my concern too. Nathan's voice softened. Thank you, Elena. I don't deserve your generosity. This isn't about you, I reminded him gently. Or even about me. It's about Olivia and her baby. Of course, he agreed quickly. Should I still come this weekend? Would that be awkward? I considered this. Nathan and I had maintained a careful professional distance since the restructuring of the company. Our personal interactions limited to divorce logistics and occasional updates about Olivia. The prospect of spending a weekend in close quarters at the lake house would certainly push the boundaries of our newly established dynamic. Come if you wish, I said finally. I think Olivia would appreciate it, and there's plenty of space for all of us. By that afternoon, I had packed enough clothes and supplies for an extended stay and was on my way to the lake house. I called Olivia en route to explain the situation, half expecting resistance to what might be perceived as an intrusion. Instead, her relief was palpable even through the phone. Thank you, she said, her voice catching slightly. I've been worried about being out here alone, but I didn't want to complain after everything you've done already. You should have told me sooner, I chided gently, about the blood pressure issues, about needing more support. I didn't want to be more of a burden, she admitted. You've already given me so much. The vulnerability in her voice reminded me of how young she really was, barely 30, facing single motherhood in circumstances none of us had anticipated. Whatever resentment I might once have harbored toward her had long since been replaced by a more complex emotional landscape. Concern, empathy, even a certain protective instinct that surprised me with its intensity. When I arrived at the Achua Lake House, Olivia was sitting on the porch swing, a light blanket draped over her legs despite the warm day. Her face brightened when she saw me, a genuine smile replacing the worried expression she had worn moments before. You didn't have to drop everything and come, she said as I carried my bags inside. I would have been fine with just more frequent check-ins. Dr. Chen was quite clear about the recommendations, I replied, setting down my luggage in the guest room, the same room I had used as a child during summer visits. Besides, I've been meaning to spend more time here. The company can function without my physical presence for a while. That evening, we fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. I prepared a simple dinner following Dr. Chen's dietary guidelines for managing blood pressure. Olivia set the table on the screened porch overlooking the lake, where the setting sun cast golden reflections across the water. We ate together, our conversation flowing more easily than I would have expected, discussing books we'd both read, sharing stories about our respective childhoods, deliberately avoiding the complicated topic of Nathan. As twilight deepened into night, Olivia grew pensive, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded, curious about what might be on her mind. "Did you ever want children?" she asked softly. Nathan told me you didn't, but I've seen how you are with your sister's kids, how natural you seem with them. The question stirred complicated emotions. I did want children, I admitted. Very much. Nathan was the one who kept suggesting we wait, for his career to stabilize, for the right project to complete, for the perfect moment that somehow never arrived. Olivia's eyes widened with the realization. "He lied to me about that too," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "He made it sound like you were the career-focused one who couldn't make room for a family." "That was the narrative he created," I confirmed, surprising myself with how little bitterness the admission carried. Time and distance had dulled the sharp edges of that particular betrayal. "I think he needed to cast me as the villain in your story to justify his own choices." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "He's good at creating narratives that serve his purposes. I'm only now starting to see how thoroughly he shaped my perception of everything, really." Nathan has always been skilled at presenting reality in whatever light benefits him most, I acknowledged. It's what made him so effective with clients, that ability to craft a compelling story around a design, to make people see what he wanted them to see. "And now?" Olivia asked. "Do you think he's capable of change? Of seeing himself honestly?" I considered the question carefully, thinking of Nathan's recent behavior, his acceptance of reduced status at the company, his efforts to reconnect with the core values of architecture, his attempts to take responsibility for Olivia and the baby. "I think he's trying," I said finally. "Whether that effort translates to lasting change remains to be seen. People can surprise you, though, sometimes even themselves." Olivia smiled faintly at that. "You've certainly surprised me," she said. "When Nathan first brought me to your house, I was terrified of you. This elegant, accomplished woman whose life I had disrupted in the worst possible way. I never imagined we'd end up here, like this." "Life rarely follows the expected path," I mused, gazing out at the moonlight rippling across the lake. "Sometimes the detours lead to more interesting destinations." The days that followed established a new rhythm. I worked from the sunroom that had been converted into a temporary office, attending virtual meetings and reviewing designs remotely. Olivia spent most mornings resting as prescribed, but joined me for lunch on the porch, often bringing a sketchbook where she had been exploring graphic design concepts. Hesitant at first, then with growing confidence as I offered encouragement. In the afternoons, we would sit together in the shade of the old oak tree, Olivia reclining on a chaise lounge while I worked on the plans for my Colorado cabin, occasionally soliciting her opinion on design elements. Her artistic eye was surprisingly astute, her suggestions thoughtful and often innovative. "You should incorporate more curves here," she suggested one afternoon, pointing to the junction between the main living space and the studio. "It would soften the transition and echo the natural lines of the mountain landscape." I studied the area she indicated, visualizing the modification. "You may be right," I acknowledged, making a quick sketch to test the concept. It would break up the angularity without compromising the structural integrity. Olivia watched as I worked, fascination evident in her expression. "I'm always amazed by how you translate abstract ideas into concrete forms," she said. "It's like watching someone speak a language I can only partially understand." "Architecture is a language," I agreed. one that bridges the artistic and the practical. That's what drew me to it initially, that balance between creative expression and functional necessity. Like parenthood, maybe, she suggested, her hands cradling her belly. Creative in how you shape a life, but ultimately practical in meeting needs and solving problems. The parallel was unexpectedly insightful, revealing a depth of thought about impending motherhood that I hadn't previously glimpsed. That's a beautiful way to think about it, I said warmly. You're going to be a wonderful mother, Olivia. Her eyes filled suddenly with tears. I hope so, she whispered. I'm terrified of getting it wrong. Every good parent is, I assured her, remembering similar conversations with my sister when her first child was born. It's the ones who aren't scared that you have to worry about. By Friday afternoon, we had settled into a comfortable coexistence that neither of us could have imagined months earlier. The arrival of Nathan's car in the driveway introduced a new variable to our established dynamic, a reminder of the complex history that had brought us to this unusual living arrangement. He emerged from his car looking uncertain, a weekend, bag slung over his shoulder and a large box tucked under his arm. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of us sitting together on the porch, clearly still adjusting to the reality of our unexpected alliance. Ladies, he greeted us, climbing the steps with careful precision. How are things here? Better, Olivia replied, her tone deliberately light. Elena's been taking good care of me. Nathan nodded, his expression a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. I brought something for the baby's room, he said, setting the box on the porch table. A mobile I found at that artisan shop near the office. It's handmade. Constellations that rotate slowly over the crib. Olivia reached for the box, her face softening. That's thoughtful, Nathan. Thank you. I rose, recognizing their need for private conversation. I'll make some tea, I offered, moving toward the door. Actually, Nathan said quickly, I brought something for you too, Elena. Surprised, I paused at the threshold. For me? He nodded, looking uncharacteristically nervous as he removed a flat package from his bag. It arrived at the office. Yesterday, I thought you might want it for the cabin project. I unwrapped the package to find a leather portfolio embossed with my initials. Inside were detailed topographical maps of the Colorado property and surrounding area, along with professional soil analysis reports and updated environmental impact studies. All the technical information I would need to adapt my cabin design to the specific conditions of the site. How did you know I was actually pursuing the project? I asked, genuinely puzzled. I hadn't discussed the cabin plans with anyone at the office except Veronica. Nathan smiled slightly. Your drafting table at home. When I came to get more clothes? Last week, I noticed the old plans were out, with new sketches beside them. I took a chance that it meant you were seriously reconsidering the project. The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught me off guard. It was exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. Not a grand display or empty gesture, but a practical contribution to something he knew mattered to me. This is perfect, I acknowledged. Thank you, Nathan. A flicker of something, like his old confidence, crossed his face before settling back into the more subdued demeanor he had adopted recently. I'm glad I guessed right. That evening, dinner was a curiously domestic affair. Nathan grilling fish on the lakeside patio while Olivia and I prepared side dishes in the kitchen. The conversation remained carefully neutral, focusing on the progress of the house renovations, developments at the company, plans for the baby's room. If there was a strangeness to our arrangement, ex-husband, pregnant mistress, and betrayed wife sharing a meal in apparent harmony, none of us acknowledged it directly. After Olivia retired early, following Dr. Chen's recommendation for plenty of rest, Nathan and I found ourselves alone on the porch. The awkwardness we had managed to avoid during dinner suddenly palpable in the night air. This is bizarre, isn't it? He said finally, breaking the silence. The three of us here, playing house like some avant-garde social experiment. I smiled despite myself. I don't think there's a social convention that covers this particular situation. No, he agreed, his gaze drifting out toward the darkened lake. Though you seem to be handling it with remarkable grace. Better than I am, certainly. I've had more practice at adapting to unexpected circumstances lately, I reminded him, but without the edge that would have colored such a comment months earlier. Nathan nodded, acknowledging the point. Fair enough. He hesitated, then added, Can I ask you something? Something I've been wondering since this all began? You can ask, I replied cautiously. I don't promise to answer. He turned to face me directly, his expression serious in the dim porch light. Why didn't you expose me immediately? When you first learned about the company, about how I had been systematically cutting you out. You could have fired me on the spot, publicly humiliated me, destroyed my career. You had every right to. The question was one I had asked myself many times over the past months. Why hadn't I opted for immediate, devastating retribution? The answer had evolved as my own emotions shifted from raw pain to something more nuanced. Several reasons, I said after a thoughtful pause. Initially, it was strategic. I wanted to understand the full scope of what had happened before taking action. Then it became about the company itself. Destroying you publicly would have damaged Morgan Architectural Innovations, harmed innocent employees, jeopardized client relationships. And now? He prompted when I fell silent. Now. Considered carefully. Now I think it's because destruction is easy. Rebuilding is harder, but ultimately more worthwhile. I chose to rebuild. The company, my life, even my understanding of what happened between us. Nathan absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. That's why you've always been the better architect, he said quietly. You understand that creation matters more than demolition. The compliment was unexpected, all the more powerful for being framed in terms we both understood intimately. For a brief moment, I glimpsed the man I had married, perceptive, appreciative of nuance, capable of genuine admiration without self-interest. The cabin plans, I said, changing the subject slightly. The topographical maps you brought, that was very thoughtful. He shrugged, but I could see he was pleased by my acknowledgement. It was the least I could do. That design deserves to be built, Elena. It's some of your finest work. Our work, I corrected automatically. Parts of it were collaborative. Nathan shook his head. The vision was always yours. I contributed some technical solutions, yes, but the soul of that design, that was entirely you. His generosity in crediting me fully for something we had once shared struck me as yet another sign of his evolving perspective. The Nathan I had married would never have minimized his own contribution so readily. When will you break ground? He asked, genuine interest in his voice. Next spring, if all goes according to plan, I replied. The revised designs should be finalized by fall, permits secured over winter, construction beginning as soon as the mountain roads are passable. I'd like to see the finished plans sometime, he said tentatively, if that wouldn't be inappropriate. I considered his request, surprised to find no reflexive resistance to the idea of sharing my creative work with him again. I'd value your technical input, I said honestly, especially regarding the cantilever system for the deck. That was always your specialty. Relief and pleasure flickered across his face. I'd be honored, he said simply. We sat in companionable silence after that, the awkwardness of earlier replaced by a tentative peace, not friendship exactly, but something approaching mutual respect. A foundation far more solid than the facade of perfect partnership we had maintained for years. The weekend passed with surprising ease. Nathan spent most of Saturday helping. Olivia set up the nursery, assembling furniture and installing the Constellation mobile above the crib. I worked on my cabin plans in the sunroom, occasionally joining them to offer an opinion on furniture placement or color schemes. By Sunday afternoon, when Nathan prepared to return to the city, something had shifted subtly in our unusual triangle. The tension that had hummed beneath the surface of our interactions had eased, replaced by a cautious acceptance of our interconnected circumstances. "I'll be back next weekend," Nathan promised Olivia as he prepared to leave. "Sooner, if anything changes with your condition." She nodded, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "We'll be fine. Elena's here." He turned to me then, hesitation in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything you're doing. I know it's far beyond what anyone would expect." "Expectations are rarely useful in unprecedented situations," I replied with a small smile. "We're all just doing our best with circumstances none of us anticipated." After Nathan left, Olivia and I settled back into our weekday routine, though something had changed in the atmosphere between us. A deeper level of trust, perhaps, or a more genuine acceptance of our unusual connection. "You and Nathan," she began tentatively as we sat on the porch that evening, watching fireflies appear over the darkening lake. "You seemed almost friendly this weekend. Is that difficult for you?" I considered the question thoughtfully. "Less difficult than I would have expected," I admitted. "There's a freedom in having moved beyond the initial pain. It allows for a clearer perspective on who Nathan is, both his limitations and his genuine qualities." "Do you think you'll ever forgive him completely?" she asked, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. "I'm not sure completely is the right framework," I replied. "Forgiveness isn't an all-or-nothing proposition. It's a process, one that has more to do with my own peace than with Nathan's absolution. I'm finding my way through it day by day." Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness too," she said. "Not just asking for it from you, which still amazes me that you've granted so generously, but also forgiving myself. For the choices I made, for believing what I wanted to believe about Nathan's marriage, about his promises. Self-forgiveness is often the hardest kind," I observed. "We hold ourselves to impossibly high standards." "You don't seem to," she countered. "You navigate all this with such balance. Even when you're setting boundaries or making difficult decisions, there's no cruelty in it. How do you manage that?" The question made me pause. How had I maintained my equilibrium through circumstances that might have broken someone else, or at least pushed them toward vindictiveness? The answer came to me with unexpected clarity. "I think it's because I never lost sight of who I am at my core," I said slowly. "Nathan's betrayal, his deception about the company, those things shook my trust, my security, but they didn't fundamentally change my values or my sense of self. When you know who you are, you can weather almost any storm without becoming something you don't recognize." Olivia absorbed this, her expression suggesting she was applying the concept to her own situation. "I'm not sure I've ever had that kind of clarity about myself," she admitted. "I've always been a bit adaptable, becoming what other people needed me to be." "That's not necessarily a weakness," I assured her. "Adaptability is valuable. The key is distinguishing between adapting your behavior to circumstances and compromising your essential self to please others." She smiled ruefully. "I think I've been doing a lot of the latter." "It's never too late to change that pattern," I said gently. "Motherhood might actually help. Nothing clarifies your priorities quite like being responsible for another human being." We fell silent then, watching as stars appeared one by one in the deepening blue of the sky. In that peaceful moment, I felt something shift within me, a releasing of tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The future remained uncertain in many ways, The unusual connection between the three of us still evolving, but I was surprisingly content with the ambiguity. My phone chimed with a message from Veronica. "How's life in the strangest triangle? Since Bermuda?" I smiled at her characteristic blend of concern and irreverence. "Unexpectedly peaceful," I typed back. "Sometimes the most unlikely arrangements yield the most valuable insights." And that, I realized, was perhaps the greatest gift of this unprecedented situation. The opportunity to discover capacities within myself I might never have known existed. Resilience deeper than I had imagined. Compassion more expansive than I had believed possible. And a sense of identity that remained unshaken even as everything around me transformed. The company was mine again. The house and lake property remained in my name. The divorce proceedings continued on course. But the true reclamation had been internal, a reassertion of self that transcended material ownership or legal rights. I had rediscovered not just what was mine, but who I was. And that knowledge would guide whatever path unfolded before me. 3 months later, autumn painted the landscape in brilliant hues of amber and crimson. I stood on the porch of the lake house, breathing in the crisp morning air, a steaming mug of coffee warming my hands. Inside, the soft sounds of a newborn's coos mingled with Olivia's gentle humming. James Morgan Taylor had arrived 2 weeks earlier. 6 pounds, 8 ounces of perfect health despite the concerns that had shadowed the final months of Olivia's pregnancy. He had his mother's delicate features and, unmistakably, Nathan's eyes. The birth had transformed our unusual arrangement yet again. Nathan had been present throughout the labor, his face a study in awe and terror as he witnessed his son's entry into the world. I had remained in the waiting room, not quite family, but more than a stranger, a category for which there was no established name. When Olivia had asked me to come meet the baby afterward, Nathan's gaze had met mine over the hospital bed, a wordless acknowledgement passing between us. This child connected us all now, a living embodiment of both betrayal and redemption. "He's beautiful," I had said sincerely, looking down at the tiny, perfect face. "Thank you for everything," Olivia had whispered, exhaustion and joy etched across her features. "I couldn't have done this without you." Now, as autumn light filtered through the trees surrounding the lake house, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us here. The divorce had been finalized a month earlier, a quiet, dignified conclusion to 8 years of marriage. The company continued to flourish under my leadership, with Nathan finding unexpected satisfaction in his returned focus on pure architectural design rather than executive management. My Colorado cabin was under construction. The foundation already laid before winter would make the mountain site inaccessible. Those plans had evolved significantly from their original conception, reflecting my own transformation. More open, more light, more connection to the surrounding landscape. "Here you are," Olivia's voice came from behind me. She joined me on the porch, James bundled against her chest in a soft wrap. "I thought you might have left already." "My flight's not until noon," I replied, turning to smile at her. "I wanted to say goodbye properly." The lake house was fully hers now, legally transferred along with funds for its maintenance and James's future education. I would be returning to the city permanently, resuming full-time leadership at the company, and planning my quarterly visits to oversee the cabin construction. "I still can't believe you're really giving us this place," she said, the familiar note of wonder in her voice. "It feels like home now." "That's exactly what it should be," I assured her. "A real home for James to grow up in." Olivia studied my face, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when this all began, when Nathan brought me to your house that night, I never imagined we'd end up here, that you would become someone I admire so deeply." I smiled, touched by her candor. Life rarely follows the expected path. "What will you do now?" she asked. "With the company secure, The divorce finalized? The cabin underway? What comes next for Elena Morgan? It was a question I had been asking myself. The past year had been defined by response to betrayal, to challenge, to unexpected circumstances. Now, for the first time in longer than I could remember, the future was entirely mine to shape. "I'm going to design again," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke it aloud. "Not just oversee the company, but actually create. My grandfather always said architects should build until they die, that each design carries forward something of your soul into the future." Olivia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You've already started with the graphic design department," she said. "The position will be waiting for me when I'm ready to return from maternity leave." "Take all the time you need," I assured her. "James only gets one infancy, and the company isn't going anywhere." The sound of tires on gravel announced Nathan's arrival. He had been commuting between the city and lake house since James's birth, balancing work responsibilities with his new role as father, a role he had embraced with unexpected devotion. We watched as he emerged from his car, arms full of groceries, and what appeared to be a small stuffed animal peeking from one bag. "He brings something new for James every time he visits," Olivia observed with affectionate exasperation. "The nursery's already overflowing." "First-time fathers," I said, with a small smile, "always compensating for their feelings of inadequacy with material offerings." "He's trying," Olivia acknowledged, "really trying, with James, with me, even with the boundaries you've established." "I've noticed," I said quietly. Nathan spotted us on the porch and raised a hand in greeting before heading inside with his packages. His relationship with Olivia had evolved into something neither romantic nor merely obligatory, a partnership focused entirely on James's well-being, with mutual respect, if not the passion that had led to their initial affair. "Will you come back to visit?" Olivia asked, her tone suggesting the question carried more weight than its surface simplicity implied. I looked out over the lake, considering my answer carefully. This place held decades of memories: childhood summers, family gatherings, my honeymoon with Nathan, and now the first days of James's life. It would be easier, perhaps, to make a clean break, to leave the lake house and all it represented firmly in the past. But the past year had taught me that clean breaks were rarely the answer, that life's most meaningful growth often occurred in the messy, complicated spaces between endings and beginnings. "Yes," I said finally. "Not too often at first. You and Nathan need time to establish your co-parenting dynamic without audience or interference. But eventually, yes. James should know the full story of his connection to the Morgan legacy, including my part in it." Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." Nathan appeared in the doorway, hesitation in his stance. "Everything okay out here?" "Just saying goodbye," I explained, setting down my empty coffee mug. "My flight leaves in a few hours." He nodded, understanding the significance of this departure, not just from the lake house, but from the intense period of entanglement that had defined our lives for nearly a year. "I'll get your bags," he offered, disappearing inside before I could respond. When we were alone again, Olivia shifted James gently in her arms. "Would you like to hold him once more before you go?" I accepted the warm bundle, looking down into the tiny face that represented both an ending and a beginning. James blinked up at me, his gaze still unfocused but somehow seeming to connect directly with mine. "Hello, little one," I murmured. "Your path may have unusual beginnings, but that just means your story will be more interesting to tell someday." Nathan returned with my luggage, setting it by the steps. He stood watching as I held his son, a complex emotion crossing his face that I couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything you've done, everything you've given. I know I didn't deserve any of it." This was never about what you deserved, Nathan, I replied, handing James back to Olivia. It was about what I chose. What kind of person I decided to be in the face of circumstances that could have destroyed us all. He nodded, acceptance, and perhaps a new understanding in his eyes. You chose better than most would have. Not better, I corrected gently. Just true to myself. I gathered my things, hugged Olivia carefully to avoid disturbing James, and descended the porch. Steps toward my waiting car. At the bottom, I turned back for one final look at the tableau they created. Olivia with James in her arms, Nathan standing protectively nearby, the lake house rising behind them like a guardian of past and future alike. It was not the life I had imagined for myself, certainly not the outcome I would have chosen when Nathan first brought his pregnant secretary into our home. Yet standing at this junction between what had been and what would be, I felt neither regret nor resentment, only a profound sense of completion. I had reclaimed far more than a company. I had reclaimed myself. And in doing so, I had discovered a capacity for transformation that would carry me forward into whatever waited beyond this unexpected chapter of my life. The future stretched before me, unmarked and full of possibility. I was ready. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.